tonight, the world is really holding its breath. You can feel it. There's this tense wait to see what happens next after a truly significant global event. We're talking, of course, about the immediate aftermath of those major U.S. military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities.
And all eyes are just fixed on Tehran now. How will they respond? What does this mean for a region that's already, well, incredibly volatile?
Absolutely. So in this deep dive, we're going to try and unpack the many, many layers of this incredibly complex situation. We'll look at everything from the initial military goals,
This huge geopolitical fallout,
all the way to the very real human cost, which often gets overlooked, and these swirling legal debates about executive power that have really blown up since the strikes.
Yeah, and for this, we're drawing on quite a bit. We've got official statements, Washington, Tehran, other international players. We've got direct reports from journalists who are right there on the ground, seeing it unfold.
Crucial perspective there.
Definitely. And then also, sharp analysis from legal experts, global affairs specialists, trying to get a really comprehensive picture.
Right. Our mission, as always, is to pull out those crucial nuggets of knowledge, the surprising facts, maybe the essential insights, so you can feel genuinely well-informed about this crisis, which is changing, practically by the hour.
It really is.
Okay, let's dive right in. Okay, let's unpack this first move. The U.S. action, quickly named Operation Midnight Hammer. And this wasn't a small operation by any means.
No, not at all. The planning, the assets involved, it clearly signals a very strategic, very high-stakes move.
We're talking American B-2 stealth bombers, those incredible flying wing designs, built for deep penetration, hard to detect.
State-of-the-art stuff.
Targeting 3 key nuclear sites deep inside Iran. And when I say deep, I really mean it. This included the Fordo enrichment plant.
Right, the one famously buried, hundreds of feet beneath a mountain, making it exceptionally difficult to target effectively.
Exactly. And our sources are emphasizing a pretty terrifying detail here. The use of uniquely powerful bunker buster bombs.
These aren't your standard munitions. They're precision-guided, designed specifically to penetrate hardened underground facilities like Fordo.
And they pack a massive punch, right? Capable of destroying even really fortified targets.
Absolutely. The choice of weapon tells you a lot about the target and the intended effect. And what's also fascinating here, maybe striking is the better word, is how immediately the U.S. declared success.
Right, almost instantly.
Yeah, the Trump administration was remarkably quick. They framed it as an incredible and overwhelming success. They used language like Iran's nuclear ambitions had been obliterated.
Strong words.
Very strong. And they also made a point of highlighting that American forces were, quote, essentially unchallenged during the operation.
Which suggests either, incredible precision and dominance in how they carried it out.
Or perhaps it speaks to the limits of Iran's defenses against that kind of advanced aerial attack. Or maybe a bit of both.
Could be. But the narrative coming out of Washington was crystal clear. Decisive action, swift victory, program degraded, complete success.
That was definitely the message they wanted the world to hear, setting that initial tone.
And it wasn't just the president saying this, right? His allies were out there pretty quickly, too.
Oh, yeah, reinforcing that narrative. Publicly, they were saying this was a limited operation with specific goals.
They really emphasized that it was not about regime change. That specific phrase kept coming up.
Which is, a crucial distinction in international law and diplomacy. It affects how allies and, adversaries see U.S. intentions.
It's meant to reassure people, perhaps, that this isn't the start of something bigger, not an attempt to overthrow the government.
Precisely. Instead, they framed the mission as being designed, and I'm quoting here, to degrade and/or to destroy 3 nuclear sites related to their nuclear weaponization ambitions.
So a very targeted, very specific public message. This is only about stopping Iran from getting the bomb, not changing who's in charge.
That was the carefully crafted line, yes.
Yeah.
But, if we connect this to the bigger picture, Trump himself seemed to maybe inadvertently undermine those arguments.
How so? What happened?
Well, there was a post on his social media platform. He wrote, and this is a direct quote, "It's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't be there a regime change?"
Wow. Okay. That definitely sends a different message.
It really does. It introduces this significant implied contradiction. While his team is busy saying no regime change, his own words suggest maybe a different, more ambitious, certainly more politically loaded long-term desire.
So it creates this kind of dissonance
Yeah.
between the official limited objective and his personal rhetoric.
Exactly. And that complicates the U.S. narrative, doesn't it? It potentially sows distrust among allies, maybe gives ammo to adversaries, raises questions about the real underlying intentions.
Definitely makes things murky. So the timing, why now? What was the White House rationale for acting at this specific moment?
They offered a few key reasons. Senator Marco Rubio, a prominent voice, claimed Iran already had, quote, materials necessary to make a nuclear weapon.
Suggesting an imminent threat, like they were right on the verge.
That was the implication, yes. That immediate, decisive action was needed. Then you had J.D. Vance, another influential figure, accusing the Iranians of stonewalling negotiations.
Implying that diplomacy had failed or was being deliberately blocked by Tehran.
Right. Basically saying, we tried talking, it didn't work, military action is the only option left.
And we heard lawmakers were getting briefed on the Hill.
Yes, a classified briefing was scheduled. Details, of course, are scarce. But predictably, Republicans mostly lined up behind the president's decision.
While Democrats were asking for more information, more justification.
Yeah, demanding more specifics about the why, pushing for greater transparency, detailed reasoning for such a huge military step with massive risks involved. And this really brings up that critical question. Was there actually enough solid intelligence, enough evidence to justify this kind of preemptive attack?
Did everyone buy the administration's reasoning?
Not at all. We saw significant pushback, and not just from the usual political opponents. Critics argued very strongly that this action, quote, should never have been authorized, in the absence of intelligence showing that Iran had decided to break out and build a bomb.
So deep skepticism about whether Iran was actually about to build a weapon right now. Echoes of past intelligence controversies, maybe.
You could definitely draw those parallels. And interestingly, this wasn't just coming from Democrats. There was real frustration from some Republicans, too, particularly within the president's own core MAGA base.
Really? Why?
Because they've grown, as they put it, tired of the wars in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. A key part of Trump's appeal to them was the promise that, quote, we wouldn't be engaging in another one.
And now,
as they see it, here we see this happening. It points to this deep weariness with foreign wars, even within his own base. It highlights a really tricky political balancing act for him domestically.
Okay, so the U.S. makes its move. The world immediately looks to Iran. What was their response?
Well, the initial reply came fast, early this morning, actually, and it was alarming. Direct escalation.
What did they do?
Missiles aimed directly at major Israeli cities. Jerusalem, Haifa, Tel Aviv.
Wow. Not proxies, but direct Iranian missiles on Israel.
Exactly. And the impact was immediate. Israel's Iron Dome system intercepted a lot of them, reportedly, but some clearly made it through. We heard reports of missiles shattering residential buildings.
Leaving destruction behind.
Yes. And the human side of it was just harrowing. We heard from one Israeli citizen, clearly shaken, describing it. We heard a tremendous boom. When we came back, we saw that the apartment was not our apartment. It was destroyed. Just
Devastating. And that kind of direct attack on Israel, I mean, that immediately spikes fears of much bigger war, right?
Absolutely. A major escalation in a region already on edge. And officially, Iran's reaction was just as strong. The foreign minister came out almost immediately. Very defiant stance.
What did he say?
Declared unequivocally that the U.S. had, quote, crossed a red line, and that Washington is now, quote, fully responsible for whatever happens next.
Putting the blame squarely on the U.S.
Completely. He condemned the strikes in really strong terms, calling it an outrageous, grave, unprecedented violation of the fundamental charter of the United Nations, referencing the UN Charter's rules against using force like this.
And on the streets, what was the feeling in Tehran?
Reports described visible, widespread defiance, citizens asserting their country's strength, their resilience. We heard from one woman at a protest, her voice apparently unwavering, saying, "It was unforgivable. Iran is stronger than they perceive."
So a strong official condemnation matched by public anger and defiance.
Yes, signaling very clearly that Iran wasn't going to take this lying down. They intended to assert their sovereignty and retaliate.
And as part of that, Iran's foreign minister is now heading to Moscow.
That's right, to consult with allies there. It's a significant strategic move, shoring up international support, coordinating diplomatically, planning next steps with key partners like Russia.
Underscores the global chessboard nature of this, doesn't it? The shifting alliances.
It really does. This crisis isn't happening in a vacuum. But here's where things get really really interesting and complicated. Despite those strong U.S. claims of incredible and overwhelming success in obliterating Iran's nuclear program,
The actual extent of the damage is still incredibly unclear.
exactly, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, they're the UN's nuclear watchdog, the ones who monitor these things, they reported no radiation detected outside the sites.
Which sounds good initially, right? No immediate fallout.
It might sound reassuring, yes. But crucially, they added a huge caveat that no one knows the extent of the damage at Iran's Fordo facility.
So basically, the international monitors are saying, we don't actually know what happened inside Fordo.
Precisely. It points to this massive information vacuum. It suggests those initial U.S. claims might have been, well, premature, maybe incomplete, possibly even overstated.
And why is it so hard to tell? Is it just because Fordo is underground?
That's a huge part of it. Satellite images, which are usually our first look, they might show, say, 6 holes on the surface, maybe lots of dust and sand. Clear signs of impact from those bunker busters.
But they can't see below the surface.
Exactly. They simply cannot see what's happened below ground. Fordo, as we discussed, is designed to be incredibly resilient, buried deep inside a mountain. So assessing the real damage from satellite photos alone, it's practically impossible. It's like looking at the lid of a box without knowing what's inside.
A literal black box situation.
Pretty much, leaving a lot open to speculation and competing claims, and adding to all this uncertainty. Iranian officials are making counterclaims. They're saying they actually moved its stockpiles of enriched uranium to a secret location some time ago.
Wow. If that's true, that changes everything, doesn't it?
It would dramatically alter the assessment of the strike's effectiveness. It could mean the U.S. hit the facility, but maybe not the crucial material itself. It could render the strike far less impactful than Washington claimed.
Has anyone else weighed in on this possibility?
Yes. Janice Stein, she's the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Policy, a really respected voice. She echoed this uncertainty. She stated it's, quote, entirely unclear what has happened to that 400-kilogram stockpile of enriched uranium.
And 400 kilograms is significant.
Oh, very significant. It's a substantial amount, potentially enough for several nuclear weapons if it were enriched further to weapons grade.
So Stein is saying we just don't know where that uranium is.
Right. She added that it seems more and more likely that the Iranians were able to move it before, or a big part of it. She also clarified something important. While some conversion facilities, those used for earlier processing steps, might well be damaged.
The location of the main fuel, the highly enriched stuff, remains unknown.
Exactly. Which is the critical piece for any disarmament goal. And then she added this really crucial, frankly chilling point about Iran already enriching uranium up to 60% purity.
Which is very close to weapons grade, right? 90% is the threshold.
Extremely close. And Stein poses this really thought-provoking question. The distance between 60% and 90% is just a sprint. Why do it?
Implying that they were already poised to make that final leap.
That's the strong implication, that much of the really hard technical work was already done. Getting to 60% is the challenging part. Going from 60% to 90% is relatively quick. It suggests Iran's path towards weaponization was already very far along, and these strikes may not have fundamentally stopped that, especially if the key material was moved.
So, okay. This brings us to a really critical question, and maybe something for you, the listener, to think about. If Iran knows it probably can't win a head-to-head conventional war against the United States,
given the massive asymmetry in military power,
what are its real, practical options for retaliation? Direct confrontation seems unlikely to end well for them.
That's right. Given that asymmetry, the most likely scenario, according to most analysts, is that Iran will opt for a carefully calibrated response, something probably coming in the next week or two.
Calibrated meaning what exactly?
Meaning actions designed to inflict pain, show resolve, maybe satisfy domestic audiences, but crucially, without provoking a massive, disproportionate U.S. counter-escalation that could spiral into a full-blown war. It's a very fine line to walk.
Okay, so what might that look like? What are the options on the table?
Well, one major option involves using its extensive network of proxy forces across the Middle East, groups aligned with Iran.
Like we've seen before.
Exactly. This could mean things like attacking unarmed American-owned oil tankers in strategic waterways. Think the Strait of Hormuz, the Persian Gulf, maybe even the Red Sea.
Hitting economic targets, disrupting oil supplies.
Precisely. It hits U.S. and global interests, impacts markets, causes disruption, but without directly engaging U.S. military personnel or assets. And using proxies offers Iran a degree of plausible deniability, even if everyone suspects who's behind it. Beyond that, there's cyber warfare. Iran has developed really sophisticated capabilities here. They're considered one of the world's most sophisticated cyber warfare actors.
So they could go after digital targets.
Absolutely. Targeting things like the U.S. energy grid, major American websites, critical internal infrastructure systems. This could cause significant disruption, economic damage, fear, all without firing a shot in the traditional sense.
And it's harder to trace definitively back to them.
Much harder. It's a low signature, potentially high impact option. And then there's the more chilling possibility. Terrorism.
Terrorism on U.S. soil.
The CIA has reportedly issued warnings about potential sweeper cells in the U.S. who could embark on a terrorism campaign. They even cited past alleged assassination efforts linked to Iranian operatives abroad.
That feels like a major escalation.
It would be the most unpredictable and potentially the most devastating form of retaliation, aiming at civilian targets, maybe high-profile individuals inside the U.S. designed purely to sow fear and disrupt normal life. It's a terrifying prospect.
So looking at these options, proxies, cyber, terrorism, what are the potential consequences? If Iran does choose to escalate significantly versus taking that more measured, calibrated path, it feels like a really dangerous crossroads.
It is an incredibly delicate and perilous balance for Tehran. A lot of geopolitical analysis right now suggests that President Trump personally hates forever wars.
That's been a consistent theme for him.
Right. His aversion to getting bogged down in long, costly conflicts is a really significant factor here. So the thinking goes, if Iran's retaliation avoids any direct attack on U.S. bases, and crucially, avoids killing American personnel,
then the U.S. might not escalate further.
then the Americans are considered not likely to escalate further. There's a belief among some analysts that Trump's judgment, his willingness to strike, perhaps changed because of the success of the operation by Israel that happened before the U.S. strikes. Maybe that success convinced him precision was possible without a massive ground commitment.
So a carefully measured Iranian response, one that avoids American casualties, might actually de-escalate things from the U.S. side, preventing that wider war Trump wants to avoid.
That's the calculus many believe is at play. It implies that the key for Iran is to show resolve, to retaliate in some way, but without crossing that specific red line, American casualties, that would almost certainly trigger a much larger U.S. military response. It's a high-stakes gamble.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Moving from the immediate military and strategic picture, let's look at the broader international reaction and, really importantly, the human side of this conflict. Because it's easy to get lost in the geopolitics and forget the real people affected. Diplomatically, what's happening? Are there efforts to calm things down?
Yes. At the UN Security Council, they are reportedly mulling a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire. This reflects widespread international alarm and a desire to pull things back from the brink.
Will it pass?
That's the big question. There are already early indications that the U.S. will veto it.
Why would the U.S. veto a ceasefire call?
Well, using the veto power in the Security Council is a standard tool for the permanent members to protect their strategic interests. In this case, the U.S. might want to maintain pressure on Iran or perhaps assert its right to act unilaterally without UN constraints. A veto would effectively block that global call for a halt to hostilities, and other countries are weighing in too. Canada's position, for instance, outlined by Prime Minister Mark Carney, tries to thread that needle.
Oh, so?
Well, he reiterated Canada's long-standing position. Canada has been consistently clear that Iran can never be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon. So acknowledging the core concern.
Okay.
But while acknowledging the U.S. action was aimed at that threat, he immediately stressed that the situation in the Middle East remains highly volatile, pointing to all the complexities, proxies, history, rivalries.
And the solution?
Diplomacy. Crucially, Carney called on all parties to return immediately to the negotiating table, emphasizing talks as the only real way forward to resolve the crisis and stop it from getting worse.
And beyond statements, Prime Minister Carney is actually traveling.
Yes, he's heading to Brussels for a NATO summit. International security will obviously be top of the agenda, especially given these events.
And there's talk of a new deal with the EU about weapons.
Apparently, yeah. potentially signing a new agreement to make it easier and cheaper to buy some weapons and ammunition. This suggests a push among allies for better military cooperation, maybe streamlining procurement.
And that defense spending target,
Yeah.
going from 2% to 5%, that sounds huge.
It's described as an eye-watering 5% of GDP. If adopted, that would be a massive increase. It really signals a profound shift in threat perception among NATO allies, a growing concern about global security, and a willingness to invest very heavily in defense and deterrence. It's a direct reflection of just how unstable the world feels right now. And these meetings in Europe, for Canada specifically, seem to fit into a larger strategy. They're being framed as part of a goal to, quote, rely less on the United States for trade and security while building on relationships with other allies.
Interesting. So diversifying partnerships, not putting all the eggs in the U.S. basket.
That seems to be the idea. A strategic shift towards strengthening ties with Europe and perhaps others, enhancing Canada's own resilience and independence. It suggests maybe a recognition that the global order is changing, and relying solely on one dominant partner might not be the best long-term strategy anymore. It's about building more options for cooperation and security in what feels like an increasingly uncertain world.
Now let's really focus on the human stories here, because they often get drowned out by the headlines about bombs and politics. The impact on ordinary people is just immense and immediate.
Absolutely.
We heard about, about 40,000 tourists who were just stuck in Israel, flights grounded after the missile attacks.
Yeah, imagine that. Being caught in a foreign country, suddenly finding yourself in a conflict zone, unable to get home. Reports say flights are starting to resume now, but they're severely limited to 50 passengers each.
So a painfully slow process to get people out.
Incredibly slow and stressful for those involved. And for Iranians trying to leave their own country, the situation sounds even more desperate.
Why? What's happening there?
Well, reports indicate that airspace closed and the internet mostly blacked out across Iran. That severely limits communication, information, escape options. People are described as scrambling to cross the border into neighboring countries, Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, just desperate to get out.
Fleeing the potential for wider conflict.
Exactly. We heard from one 25-year-old who managed to get out. His description was chilling. I saw an explosion in front of my home, and it was terrible. Most of the people just want to live in peace.
This captures the terror for ordinary citizens caught in the middle, doesn't it?
It really does. Caught in a war they didn't ask for, lives turned upside down.
And that worry, it stretches far beyond the immediate conflict zone. Think about Iranian-Canadians right here. We're hearing about this overwhelming sense of helplessness.
Unable to reach loved ones back in Iran.
Exactly. We heard this incredibly emotional account from a woman, Miss Sahifa. She hasn't been able to speak to her mother, who's a dual citizen, stuck in Iran, for 4 days. 4 agonizing days.
That must be unbearable.
She said trying to get her mother out via land borders just feels too dangerous right now, with all the instability. In her words,
It's hard. I wish that I was there with her. It just captures that anguish of being separated, helpless, uncertain. She talked about having to put on a brave face while inside, just wanting to cry out, I'm worried.
that's heartbreaking.
And another story that really highlights the practical nightmare is from Bahar Motamedian. Her father is an Iranian citizen, but he has a valid Canadian visa. He should be able to come here for safety.
But he can't get out.
He's completely trapped. Because currently there are no direct flights operating for Iranian citizens, only for Canadian citizens. So, as she put it, there is no option for my dad to get out of the country.
Wow. Having the right paperwork, the visa, but no physical way to use it, that's just tragic. And it really makes you think about the long-term emotional toll, the psychological burden of living through this, even from afar. Bahar mentioned how, for her generation of Iranians, the idea of a U.S. strike has been like a 40 years nightmare, this constant looming fear.
And now it's real. And now it's happened. Her worry for her father is just palpable. She asks, can I see my dad again? Can I talk to him again? I don't know the next time that I can see my dad. She emphasized how this conflict makes the future more uncertain for all of us, all Iranians around the world. It's that profound weight of unpredictability, the constant fear for family caught up in it all.
It really underscores that human cost. Beyond the individual stories, though, we've also seen significant public reactions, protests around the world.
Yes, reflecting widespread concern and dissent. In major U.S. cities, New York's Times Square, L.A., Washington, Boston reports said hundreds flooded into the streets.
Drawing comparisons to past conflicts.
Yeah, explicitly drawing parallels to the protests before the 2003 Iraq invasion. People voicing fears about another potentially long, costly war in the Middle East, driven by what they see as flawed foreign policy. And here in Toronto, too.
Yes. In Toronto, hundreds were out as well, calling for peace in Iran, really emphasizing the suffering already happening on the ground. One protester said powerfully, "People on the ground are really suffering already, and it's ridiculous to continue to have more violence," adding, "I don't want any more innocent people to be killed, and there's no reason for the U.S. to enter this war."
A clear anti-war message.
Predominantly, yes. But it's also important to acknowledge it wasn't monolithic. There were other voices, even among those deeply concerned about Iran. Some, while obviously opposing war and the suffering it brings, also expressed a complex view. Seeing this moment, however painful, as perhaps an opportunity to finish the job, as one person put it, referring to efforts to end the current Iranian regime, linking it to struggles started decades ago.
So a mix of perspectives even within the diaspora. Hope for change mixed with fear of violence.
Exactly. It highlights the really complex, often conflicting emotions and desires within communities affected by this deep desires for political change, often juxtaposed with profound fears of more bloodshed and instability. Okay, so let's pivot now. We've looked at the strikes, the retaliation, the international reaction, the human cost. What about the legal underpinnings? This whole situation has really ignited a fierce debate here in the U.S., right?
A very heated debate, yes. Primarily over whether these strikes actually constituted an act of war in the legal sense, and maybe more fundamentally, whether President Trump even had the constitutional authority to order them without getting approval from Congress first.
What's the core argument against his authority?
It's pretty straightforward, constitutionally speaking. Senator Bernie Sanders put it very bluntly. It is so grossly unconstitutional. All of you know that the only entity that can take this country to war is the U.S. Congress. The president does not have the right.
Strong words. Was he alone in that?
Not entirely. Even on the Republican side, Representative Thomas Massie called it a bad move legally and constitutionally. Their argument rests squarely on Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. Which explicitly gives Congress, not the president, the sole power to declare war. So the legal fight boils down to this. Does bombing nuclear sites deep inside another country using bunker busters and cruise missiles count as war in that constitutional sense?
Or is it something else, some kind of lesser military action that the president can authorize?
That's the gray area presidents have operated in for decades. Does it require a formal declaration of war from Congress? Or has practice evolved to allow the president more leeway for these kinds of strikes?
But this is where it gets really complicated, right? Because Trump isn't exactly acting in a vacuum here. He's relying on what past presidents have done.
Absolutely. That's the crucial context. He's operating within and arguably counting on the precedents set by presidents going back decades. There's been this gradual but significant expansion of executive power when it comes to military action, often bypassing Congress.
How has that happened? Can you give some examples?
Sure. I mean, look, in the modern era, say, the last 60 or 70 years, presidents from both parties have consistently claimed and exercised the power to attack other countries without getting prior formal authorization from Congress, without a declaration of war.
So it's become the norm, almost.
It has arguably become the de facto norm, steadily chipping away at Congress's constitutional role. Think about 2011. President Barack Obama launched airstrikes in Libya. His administration famously argued the U.S. weren't engaged in hostilities, even though those strikes went on for over 7 months, and NATO got involved.
And that bypassed limits set by Congress.
It effectively sailed right past the 60 to 90-day time limit set by the War Powers Resolution of 1973. That was the law passed after Vietnam specifically to curb presidential power in this area.
So a clear precedent there. Any others?
Oh, yeah. Go back further. President Harry S. Truman initiated the Korean War, a conflict that ultimately led to over 1 million deaths. How did he frame it initially? Not as a war requiring congressional approval, but as a police action.
Just a police action.
Right. These examples and others show how presidents have managed to get around those constitutional red lines and legislative guardrails that were supposed to limit their power to initiate military force.
And Congress often goes along with it, or can't stop it.
Well, the reality often is, as analysts point out, when you have a united executive branch, which often happens when military action is initiated facing a divided Congress, which is common, The president wins. They control the intelligence, they can act quickly, and Congress is often hesitant to challenge a president directly in a perceived crisis, especially early on.
And it's probably fair to say this strike on Iran wasn't universally popular, even for Trump, right? Even within his own base.
That's an important point, yes. It was not necessarily a popular decision, even among many in his core MAGA base. As we discussed, many of his supporters are deeply skeptical of foreign interventions. They feel it costs too much blood and treasure and doesn't serve American interests.
So his political standing could actually be affected by this,
Yeah.
depending on what happens next.
Absolutely. If you connect this to the bigger picture domestically, his political fortunes really hinge on the fallout. His base, as we said, has long made clear they want no part of foreign wars. That was a core promise.
So if this stays limited,
If this remains a one-off, a quick, decisive strike, mission accomplished, no further escalation, U.S. isn't dragged into something bigger and bloodier, then he may emerge a hero again to his supporters. It validates his decisive image while maybe still fitting the America First narrative by dealing with a threat quickly.
but if it goes badly,
But if it's the opposite, if the U.S. finds itself getting sucked into another long, messy conflict, maybe with casualties starting to mount, then Trump could find himself in real trouble at home. He could face a serious backlash from the very voters who put him in office, feeling betrayed on that core promise of avoiding new wars.
it seems the initial public reaction often favors the president when military action starts, right?
Yeah.
Especially if there aren't immediate costs.
That's generally true. There's often a rally around the flag effect. The president holds a huge advantage initially, especially if there's a perceived low risk to American troops and no immediate body count. But, and this is critical, if casualties start to happen, that changes the conversation dramatically. Public support can erode very, very quickly, and political pressure on the White House ramps up intensely. History shows that repeatedly.
Okay, so as we start to wrap up this deep dive, let's just quickly recap the main tensions we're left with. It's a really volatile mix.
It absolutely is.
You've got the U.S. strongly claiming a successful strike. Say they obliterated Iran's nuclear ambitions.
Juxtaposed with Iran's very defiant retaliation against Israel and these veiled but serious threats of further, perhaps asymmetric responses to come.
And overlaying all that is this deep uncertainty about what actually happened to Iran's nuclear program. Did they hit the facilities? Yes. Did they destroy the capability? We just don't know, especially with those questions about the uranium stockpile.
Right. The IAEA saying they can't verify the damage at Fordo is huge.
And then, of course, the profound human costs we discussed, and the massive geopolitical ripples spreading out from this.
Jenna Stein, who we mentioned earlier, offered a really interesting take on how the U.S. might view this internally, at least for now.
What was her assessment?
She said, when asked if the U.S. would see it as a success, yes, I do. Why? Because their military showed that they can do something that no military in the world can do. It was a demonstration of unique American capability, precision, deep penetration strikes.
A show of force, essentially.
Exactly. And this is the crucial caveat she added immediately. If there's tremendous blowback, people will look at this from the perspective of history and think, no, that wasn't a success. But until and unless that happens, they will.
So the definition of success is totally dependent on what happens next. It's not fixed.
Precisely. It's fluid. History, not the immediate press releases, will be the ultimate judge. And that judgment depends entirely on the consequences that unfold in the coming days, weeks, and months.
Okay, so as you, our listener, reflect on everything we've covered in this deep dive, maybe here's a final thought to chew on. What seems really clear is this profound tension right at the heart of American democracy and its foreign policy. We've talked about the precedents set by past presidents, this decades-long trend of military action without formal declarations of war from Congress. We've seen the inherent power the commander-in-chief holds, especially in the modern era, with advanced technology and rapid deployment capabilities. So the question becomes, does the U.S. actually have a truly functional system of checks and balances anymore when it comes to starting military conflicts abroad? Or has the executive branch become, in practice, largely unconstrained in this absolutely critical area? Has Congress's constitutional power to declare war become, well, almost a historical footnote? And if that's the case, what might be the long-term consequences of this evolution, this concentration of war-making power in the executive? Not just for American democracy itself, but maybe for global stability. When one leader, effectively, has the power to decide matters of war and peace, but potentially very little immediate oversight